the amazing digital circus. I'm sure you're all familiar with it by now, as the newest animation taking the world not just by storm, but by freaking hurricane. It's weird, it's bouncy, it's demented, love it or hate it, it really is the kind of animated experience you could only get from an indie team. But one thing about it that's always stood out to me is what it was inspired by. Not just in general tone and the creator repeatedly posting about it on social media, but even taking some cues from it in the character design, that being a little, nearly 50-year-old bomb named Raggedy Ann and Andy, a musical adventure. I should start this by saying I've been aware of this movie for roughly 10 years now. Word of it's been passed around animation enthusiasts for a much longer time than that, but I happened to be on a thief in the cobbler kick at the time, and took notice of this similar preservation job from the same group of people. It turns out, much like the thief, it actually has a very fascinating background to it, and I think now, in the hype of the digital circus, is as good a time as any to really talk about it to you guys. Master animator Richard Williams, who had been fascinated with the art form ever since seeing Snow White at the age of 4, had built his own studio situated in London across the late 60s into the 70s, taking on a bunch of commercial projects, some short-form work, and even a few Christmas specials to help get the aforementioned passion project off the ground. But somewhere along the line, he found himself taking on something a little more ambitious. A little musical project based on a popular ragdoll conceptualized by Broadway producer Richard Horner and written by Pat Thackeray and Max Wilk, with the blessing of the Bob's Merrill Company. Originally made with the intent of being a stage play, it then transitioned into a live-action television special for Hallmark, the screenplay being written with that in mind. But over time, it was decided that it would be too unbelievable a sell for live action. Man, can you imagine that line of thought nowadays? So another producer named Lester Osterman then approached Williams with this new proposal to turn it into an animated film. Richard was, at first, reluctant to take it, suggesting it instead go to John Hubley, but he found himself impressed by both the script and score that he was given, so he signed on. Following that, the man that was first tapped to direct the feature was Abe Levito, an animator mostly known for his close associations with Chuck Jones. But Abe passed away in early 1975, so Williams was pushed into carrying the mantle himself. Now, one important thing to know about Richard Williams Studios, it was more than just a means to forward his personal dreams. It was also to help preserve the true art of animation that was fast getting lost in the age of TV. Many veterans from all walks of the Golden Age were hired at the studio and spent their time there training an ensemble of much younger talent who would work with them as assistants, essentially passing over the torch before leaving the world for good. And you can tell the film cares so much about the legacy of these talents because the opening credits list the characters not by their actor, no, but by their lead animator. In a perfect world, every animated film ever made would do this. So in many ways, projects like Raggedy Ann were a learning exercise, and sure enough, a few of the credited assistants here are people like David Block, Dan Haskett, and Eric Goldberg. So yeah, safe to say that if it wasn't for Richard Williams, we may well not have some of the most influential animation to ever come out of the Disney Renaissance and beyond. But I'll talk more about the actual animation later. Sadly, the more production went on, the more it just fell apart. It was all a very rough case of Murphy's Law, as described by this very detailed production book by John Canemaker, linked in the description. The live-action portion starring Richard's daughters Claire went by in October 75 with little issue, but by the start of 76, after seeing a work print called a Leica reel, he decided to trim the film from 108 minutes to the 85 in the final, all the while accounting for an extra 3 months than originally intended. This was to both keep the standards high, while also making the pacing more tight and less drawn out. And from there, disconnects occurred between the multiple art studios, complicated camera techniques pushed the crew to their limits, animators jumped ship in a matter of months, and the budget ran out by the end, leading it to it all being a massive crunch job by the end. But they made it, and it premiered in March 1977. But despite that, and the film failing at the box office despite a huge marketing campaign, which apparently included a live performance of Ragdolly at the Macy's Day Parade, the hell? Richard Williams did ultimately get the funds and experience he wanted. Now with a full animated feature under his belt, he had the confidence boost to go forward with The Thief and strictly under his pure, unfiltered vision. Even if I have to make commercials for another 10 years to complete it. Yeah, that sure aids like milk. Even the story of what this film went through after the fact is kinda fascinating, in that it probably shouldn't have caught on this much, let alone after this many years. Like I said, it flopped in theaters and only got one official home media release, that being a VHS in the mid-80s, in really shitty pan and scan. Like, wow, this looks so choppy and cluttered, how the hell can you watch it like this? From what I hear, it also received considerable airplay on Disney Channel, back when it was home to many a weird film of this type. But even still, due to what is assumed are copyright complications that the parties never got around to sorting out, it has never been brought out in any official capacity since 1992. It was only in 2007 that Richard Williams megafan and restorationist Garrett Gilchrist dug up an original 35mm print and shared a scan of it all across the internet, making it the first time the film has ever been seen in its original CinemaScope widescreen since its run in theaters. It kinda stayed a weird little footnote in animation fans from that point on, but then during the COVID-19 pandemic, something happened. More people outside the die-hard enthusiasts come across the film by chance, and it strikes a chord with them in a way past gens didn't. Enough for them to make some YouTube compilations with adorable thumbnails, and enough for Garrett and his team to finally go through with scanning more prints of the film they've obtained and in higher resolution, giving the world HD scans and making it all even more gorgeous looking than it ever has before. So what about the film stuck out then and now, despite all it had working against it over the years? Well, let's actually look at it as it stands to find out. Of course, the main star in the whole picture is, objectively, the animation. We discussed that fact before. The toys, especially early on, are all drawn to move in such fun, unique ways, staying true to the types of toys they are. This includes the straw-like texture on Grandpa here, the joints and extra arms on Maxie Fix-It, the very bouncy physics on Topsy, the twin pennies, and the way they make you uncomfortable.
What?
And the almost comic daintiness on Babette. But the most significant here are probably the Raggedys themselves. Not just in their slumpy physics feeling very true to how they'd actually move, but also the very unconventional, almost rule-breaking choice to have their toy eyes never blink. Most of the time anyway. And yet they still always feel focused and engaged in the scene. Shows how much good creative talent can just sell an illusion to the audience without them even realizing it. And there's a few other general spots of note here. Similar to the toys, the little loonies are designed as very insane and springy without quite feeling overbearing. There's some really attractive effects tossed here and there too, like the camels in the sky our wrinkled friend keeps hallucinating. And of course, the transitions that occur whenever it actually switches to and from live action. Yeah, it's obvious what is actually going on here, but the dedication to making the drawing match the scene, along with the score, which I'll get into later, really make it feel magical. However, there are a certain few scenes that get much of the love, and deservingly so, as they were clearly designed to be the big money sequences of the feature. An early one is Andy's No Girls Toy sequence, which apparently was largely animated by Williams himself. What's already a fun enough song is greatly elevated by how Andy here moves as he dances.
I won't beg round tomorrow for the kind of affection that was free today. Oh,
look at the attitude, the fluidity, the flexibility. It just goes so ham and makes his descent into madness a pure joy to watch. Candy Hearts and Paper Flowers has a bunch of beautifully painted woodsy backgrounds, accompanied by some really fun, lively ragdoll animation from Tissa David, one of the few celebrated female animators of the time, and someone who worked alongside legend Grim Natwick. Blue is full of beautiful attention to detail, from all the different bags and lumps on the camel, courtesy of vintage Disney great Art Babbitt and some of his last ever work, to having all these twinkling stars in the background, like, wow, who would even think to look for that? But easily the visual highlight of the film, all you familiar know it, is the Greedy. Animated by Warner Bros. Vet of 20 years, Emery Hawkins, the Greedy is this giant, chummy, but extremely hungry mass of taffy who, no matter how much he eats, or at least thinks he eats, he always still craves for more.
How do you do it?
Apart from just how much trippy fun is had with his constant morphing and shifting, look at how many lines and sweets and stuff are always moving with the taffy on the screen. It is all animated as one gigantic, detailed, constantly moving mass, and according to existing accounts, it was a complete bitch to paint. It is the definition of going 150%, and all for what's ultimately a throwaway sequence at that. Unfortunately, because he did go over time and budget, and because the master animators could only do so much of the work, it ain't all perfect. Because such a priority was put on select scenes, others look considerably lesser. Not for lack of effort, of course. These must have been rushed out in order to compensate for the ambition, but the fact we do get such a high quality leads to some parts looking considerably more stilted and empty. Not bad per se, at least in most cases, like what the hell is this panning shot, but it's very painfully obvious where the corners were cut. In general, the second half of the movie has fewer impressive bits than the first, probably because they blew most of their resources early on and also how the story became more and more messy. Compare how the toys are animated at the beginning to how they're animated at the end, and the difference is night and day. It's not jarring to the untrained eye, but pretty much all the fluidity they had becomes sorely missed. Now, with this being a musical movie, naturally I should talk about that component too, especially given who provided the score and songs, Joe Raposo. I've actually talked about him on my channel before, specifically the couple Dr. Seuss specials he worked on, but his main line of work was composing various projects for the Muppets and Sesame Street, creating many an immortal series staple which include
It's not that easy being green, having to spend each day the color of the leaves.
Sing a song.
Sing a song.
Sing out loud.
Sing out
That's
loud.
good.
Somebody come and play. Somebody come and play today.
Such an underrated talent, man. His style is definitely heavy on the whimsy and lighthearted, fitting for a film all about nursery toys. And if you listen closely to some bits of the soundtrack, you can even hear some familiar instrument choices pop up.
Candy hearts and paper flowers.
Admittedly, for a story that puts such heavy focus on the songs, with them being made before even considering putting it to animation, they're kinda all over the place. Many of the early ones succeed pretty well in delivering that sort of Broadway musical feel, giving the characters an avenue to express their feelings as they're being introduced or just establishing the mood. They're no Grammy Award winners, but they're cute and likable, and in some cases are able to really sell the tone. My two personal favorite numbers are actually back-to-back of each other and are both ones I mentioned earlier, the first being Candy Hearts and Paper Flowers, which although it does go on a bit too long and can easily be read in an unfortunate way, it is composed so perfectly.
Times when you're real down and low.
Every lonely place I go.
Even more so when mixed with the vocals by Didi Khan and Mark Baker. While also being plain wholesome and seeing how these two comfort each other, it's impossible to listen to it without smiling. And then right after, we get the Camel song Blue, where by contrast, he just mopes about his lonely life with such colorful language, all with a fitting but not overbearing country twang.
I look around and see the sweet life everywhere.
It's a bit on the heavy-handed side, sure, but dang it, maybe it's the visuals. I can't not feel sorry for him. Pity these two kinda ruined the mood by being all, "May I have this dance, miss?" Sure, I also want to give special mention to the opening number where Anne describes what she saw alongside Marcella. The lyrics aren't all there, sure, but the orchestration and Khan's voice really pulled this one too.
And what do I see? It's a face as smiling and as hopeful as my own face has to be. See something pretty.
However, the longer you go on, the more samey and disposable these songs start to feel. Like they all start to blend together, and by the end, it's to an almost painful degree how phoned in some of them are. The actual score remains as good as ever, but it's here where you can tell making the songs such a priority proved more of a hindrance on the story than a support. Which is a shame given Raposo's talent.
It's impossible to be lord of everything you see. Then you're down so far you can't see far at all.
Fun fact, he also appears at the very beginning of the film as the bus driver.
Bye-bye, Marcella. Have a nice weekend.
You may have noticed I haven't actually talked about the story up to now, and that's because it's pretty messy. It starts out on a simple, innocent enough note. Marcella gets a new French doll who gets captured by this captain toy, and Raggedy Ann and Andy must venture through the spooky outside world in order to get her back. But then, by the 40-minute mark, it descends into pure madness. From the greedy to this weird void area to the loonies, and it all just loses more and more of its focus from there. And the more you look at the way it's paced, you'll notice that there is a lot of sitting around and establishing stuff with little in the way of payoff. Of all characters, the only one that I can say gets a definitive arc is Babette, and even most of that takes place off screen. Though I will say, this right here is one hell of a twist reveal.
Sails trimmed and mizzened, Captain Babette.
That's the spirit, boys! Soon we will be in Paris, and I will show you the real highlight!
Matter of fact, the only real time a character gets actual focus is when they are given a number to sing, which generally wind up going to whichever wacky character we are just meeting for the first time, who usually goes away after 5 minutes anyway. The camo's always there for the journey, but apart from his hallucinations, he doesn't really do much, at least that couldn't have been done by the Raggedies. There are some nice character moments here and there between the overdose of songs, but they end up feeling more like bit players in their own film most of the time. And on top of that, the plot loses itself so much that it devolves into a total non-climax. No kidding, the king gets deviant art inflation, don't question it, his body gets popped like a balloon, and...
Shiver me timbers!
Save me, Raggedy
What are you doing out here?
Yeah, it's a cute playtime idea that the adventure they had was all in their backyard, but that clearly wasn't the intent as the story was being developed. Genuinely, this feels like they wrote themselves in a corner and this was the only way they could think out of it. It just kinda serves to tie everything in a nice little bow, which is certainly heartfelt, but not exactly earned. Which really is a bit of a letdown with its attractive exterior. After the film came and went, a handful of the songs would pop up in a few other works Raposo was attached to.
When you can't find a friend and the road doesn't seem to end.
Quiet fireside, doors that open wide, smiles that welcome me.
He would even go on to adapt the story into, what else, a Broadway musical with William Gibson, going in a very different, much darker direction than the film, and it fared even worse. So yeah, you could definitely say this was one story where the parts very greatly exceed the whole. But that said, yeah, in today's generation, which is all about looking at detached portions Family Guy funny moment style, it's no wonder it's become all the easier to admire those parts in the age of the internet. And it's within really looking closer at the film can you also fully appreciate its very pretty color work, its wonderful voice acting including George S. Irving, Mason Adams, and like I said, Didi Khan, that really give each character its personality, no matter how much the writing itself does them justice. And just the fact that someone with this much talent and experience in animation was able to work his magic with a character like this and be this creative about it, even if it didn't turn out so well, you have to love that type of combination. And again, with what I said before about Richard Williams Studios keeping the tricks of the trade alive while Disney was well in their post-Walt rut, and TV set the standards of the medium rather low, it can't be understated how much this and all the other projects there pretty much kicked off the strides in both TV and film animation from the mid-80s onward. Sure, there were always compromises to be had, including in this film, but I think that just shows the importance of valuing the individual touch. No matter how much the corporate system loves to make you believe otherwise, talent for an art form like this is indispensable, and only when they are recognized for their experience and expertise are we really able to make the most of the art form. Everyone is the sum of their influences, as they say, and not only was this a good example of exactly that, but also the massive benchmarks this would go on to partially influence itself, even if we didn't know it at the time. The fact and act of preservation from a small group of historians has ballooned into not just building a whole new fan base, but even inspiring the hottest new animation trend, I think communicates an important lesson. Even when met with failure at first, and no matter how much it's put through the ringer after the fact, there's always time for the audience to start building. There is indeed a crowd for your product. You just need to somehow realize it, whether by yourself or from another party giving it the push it needs. Film is special, animation is special, and each piece we get, no matter the treatment and accessibility, is proof of that.